Good afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Doug Buchanan, Editor-in-Chief of Columbus Business First and a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. I'm also proud to be the chair of CMC's Program Committee, which is our editorial board. Today's live stream is presented by the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and by the Columbus Dispatch. CMC's partner in the Democracy in Crisis series is WOSU Public Media. Let's thank all of those supporting today's forum. Okay, on to today's program. This is the fourth in our Democracy in Crisis series. Our previous programs featured New Republic editor Michael Tomasky that examined attacks on the court system and it discussed threats to democracy from extremism. Today, we look at misinformation. The First Amendment protects our freedom to say almost anything with few restrictions, but when that freedom is abused, do we need new rules? And can truth in media be regulated? To help answer these questions, please welcome today's panelists. Andrew Alexander, the Scripps Howard Visiting Professor at Ohio University. Go ahead and we'll do them individually. Dr. Eddith Dashiell, Professor and Director of the E.W. Scripps Program of Journalism at Ohio University. Dr. David Stebenne, Professor of History and Law at The Ohio State University. And our host, Mike Thompson, Chief Content Director of News and Public Affairs with WOSU Public Media. You can learn more about the speakers in the flyer, and now let's get on with the show. Mike, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Doug. As Doug mentioned, this is our fourth, and in the past we have looked at democracy in crisis, and we've blamed the Senate, we've blamed extremists, we've blamed the courts, and today, my favorite, we get to blame the media. So, now, we know the media is more than just the daily newspaper, the TV networks, the local radio stations, and while all of those mediums have fallen short over the decades, the level of misinformation and vitriol right now that's out there seems unprecedented. But is it? And is there anything we can do about it while protecting the sacred right to free speech that the founders put number one in the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution? So before we begin, allow me to relay those 45 words of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Lots of run-on sentences in the Constitution, by the way. David Stebenne, founders put that first in the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment in the Constitution. It comes ahead of guns, which come in second. Did the founders feel that the freedom to practice speech and religion was the most important right when they were forming the Union?
Am I on in terms
Yes.
of sound?
Yeah.
Good. Just want to be clear on that. I don't know. That's a great question. It's hard to know, but they did view it certainly as one of the most important to the functioning of a republic, right? And they wrote it in response to abuses during the period when the British government ran the 13 colonies. In other words, this was not a sort of list of things that dealt with hypothetical problems. The First Amendment is literally written in response to problems that the colonists had with the British government. Seditious libel, the notion that you can't say certain things about the rulers and you could be put in jail, et cetera, et cetera. And so your question took me a little bit by surprise because there's so much to the First Amendment. I'm sort of zeroed in on the press freedoms part for the moment. But as you also alluded to in your introduction, there was a very partisan press at the founding of the country. So much of the tone and content of what was printed then would seem disturbingly familiar today. But of course, what's been transformed is how ubiquitous that kind of stuff now is in the culture and how many people it reaches, including those who are kids, right? In other words, that's really different. And one of the challenges of this, if you skew a little older, is when you think of the First Amendment and press freedom, you think of newspapers, whereas much of the problem is not really so much newspapers at the moment.
Eddith, Dashiell, the Supreme Court decisions have given us pretty wide latitude to say what we want. We can spew the most hateful things. We could advocate violence so long as it's violence in theory, not direct violence right away. We can say false things about public officials so long as we didn't know they were false when we said them. Is this system working for our democracy?
Well, I'll tackle that one by piggybacking on your first
Please.
question.
Yeah.
I tell my communication law students on the first day of class 2 things. Well, I tell them a lot of things, but the first two things I like to stress is that in case they're on a game show, the First Amendment isn't the First Amendment because they thought it was the most important right. There were 2 other proposed amendments before we got to the First Amendment, but those 2 weren't ratified. So it became the First Amendment by default. And so I don't necessarily think that the Founding Fathers, they thought it was an important right, but I also think those other rights in the Bill of Rights, those 10, the other 9, were equally important. I don't think they were rank ordering them necessarily, but because it could have been the Third Amendment if the first 2 had been ratified. And whether or not, I think now, getting to your question about is our democracy in danger because of we can lie about people within reason, I don't think that's the problem with democracy. The second thing I tell students is that people fall into this assumption that the First Amendment was written for the press. And it's the press's responsibility to protect the First Amendment. And I stress that it doesn't make any difference if you're a journalist or not. If you're living in the United States, the First Amendment applies to you too. So any attempt to silence a group because you disagree with that group's opinion, that same strategy can be used to silence you. And so when I'm supporting the First Amendment right of the Ku Klux Klan to speak, as long as they don't touch me, but or other extremist groups that might have a different opinion than mine, or I might feel threatened or harassed by, I think if I'm successful in silencing them, they could turn around and use the same logic, the same to shut me up. And I'd rather keep my First Amendment rights, thank you very much. And so sometimes we have to put up with speech with which we disagree.
Andrew, the difference, and David mentioned it, the difference is that protected speech now does not have to wait for the daily newspaper to arrive on your doorstep. It doesn't have to wait for the 6 o'clock news. It's immediate. It is published by millions. It is shared by millions more. Had the founders foreseen this, would the First Amendment be any different, do you believe?
I have no idea. But, well, we can't know. I mean, this gets into originalist theory and all that. But I will say that the more I read about the First Amendment, I'm just sort of in awe of how visionary it was. And sort of keying on what Eddith said, and she's really around students a lot more than I am. I'm a Washington journalist that comes in and helps out a lot. But being around young people, you have to tell them you have to fight for this, and you have to understand it. And there was a very famous survey, probably about 2018, that found that among college students and senior high school students, that more students could name the key characters of The Simpsons than they could name the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. That's pretty scary, you know. So we have our work cut out for us to educate particularly young people, but also adults. And it sort of gets to the answer of, I think, you have to fight for this, and the more you understand it, and it is complex, it's very difficult to know where to draw the line, but the more we have debates, the more we have forums like this to discuss it, the better off we are.
David, through history, government has regulated free speech. The Roosevelt administration, with the help of the Catholic Church, but the Roosevelt administration used the FCC to shut down Father Coughlin, who was spewing some anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi sympathizing speeches to a huge audience. His audience was as big as Rush Limbaugh's audience was in the late 1930s. The Kennedy administration used the Fairness Doctrine to combat conservative talk radio. So that there have been restrictions on free speech. Were they correctly used? This is not new what we're talking about here.
Well, again, a really big question, because over the sweep of American history, there have been some really bad examples. One thinks of the late 1790s and the Adams administration basically going after the Jeffersonian opposition, jailing a newspaper editor and congressman, that sort of thing, putting them behind bars, all the rest. World War I. A very divisive event, in part because of what it meant for people of Germanic ancestry in this country, led to the shutting down of all kinds of German language newspapers and so on. So yes, one of the interesting questions about this is, to what degree should government regulation, increased government regulation, attempt to address this problem? And I think most of us would prefer to have people make good choices by themselves rather than use the arm of government coercion. Although, again, I may harp on this a little bit today. What troubles me the most is not so much adults, although that's a problem. It's the young, who tend to get most of their information in this very instantaneous electronic way and don't yet have the information base that enables them to choose wisely and figure out what's true and what's not true. And yet their capacity in some cases for doing very real harm based on what they've seen is tremendous in schools.
In my day, people would complain that people my age got all their news from television and weren't reading newspapers anymore, and that was a danger to America. Is that any different from folks here?
Although the TV news model of not to out you, Mike, is over 40.
Just a little.
It was 3 middle American, middle-aged, middle-of-the-road news anchors not saying terribly different things each night. In other words, the amount of content in there that would send youngsters into a violent rage and go get guns, not really there. Very different now, right? And so, but the interesting challenge for me is what can be done as we enter a more pro-natalist era, where we seem likely to have, at least for a while, fewer immigrants and more people born in this country and therefore raised here. How do we create an environment, a news environment that is child and family friendly? And that will involve more, I think, than individual initiative. There's going to have to be a role for government in that.
Eddith, can the market do that? Can the consumers do that all by itself, or do we need guardrails against false information getting out? I'm going to ask you, Eddith, here, go ahead.
Well, they're already, well, we can tell just by what we see on social media that we can't rely on consumers to force businesses to self-regulate and to behave and not be put out hateful, deliberately false information. But you keep using the term misinformation, and you're attaching it to journalism. I think individuals who are trained journalists, they make mistakes. They correct, sometimes they have to correct errors, but they don't deliberately share misinformation. That's not what they're doing. The people who are sharing the misinformation are those who don't understand the First Amendment, those who couldn't name the rights within the First Amendment, and that those rights also apply to them, as well the responsibility to that. There was never the assumption that the First Amendment is absolute. I mean, there are limits. What makes it difficult is this information is now being shared through the internet, and it's not just the United States conversation. It's a worldwide conversation.
But should you regulate journalists more differently than you regulate average person expressing their right to free speech?
No. Like I said, they're not the ones dishing out the misinformation.
Yeah. And that's a very slippery slope. You know, you look in authoritarian regimes, there are countless efforts to license journalists. We do not want that. That is, the minute you start licensing, you are drawing a line as to whether someone adheres to your version of truth or journalism. I mean, it is messy, but it's what's wonderful about our country is that you can go up in your attic and call yourself a journalist and start blogging, and the market will essentially determine whether you have an audience or not. And if I could just briefly, we're getting into remedies here. There's no simple remedy to this problem of misinformation, but I'm sort of intrigued by the movement toward news literacy, particularly in schools. And just let me share one anecdote from just a couple of years ago. There is probably the gold standard for press freedom in the world is something called the World Press Freedom Index. It comes out every May. It's like 30 or 40 indices that rank countries on, do you jail journalists, do you punish them for this or that, do you have free expression? There are about 190 countries in this. It will probably shock you. The United States is now in the 40s. We are, I think, under Trump, we were 45th. I think we've moved up to 43rd. So pretty terrible. So a couple years ago, I was in Washington at a panel about the release of the new statistics on world press freedom. And it probably won't surprise you that the leaders were the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and all that. So on this panel was the woman who was the ambassador from Denmark to the United States. And she was asked, how is this? How do you always rank so high? And one of the things that she posited was that in these countries, particularly in Denmark, news literacy is a part of core curriculum in schools. And I find this being around young people that they see something on the internet, and we all know this, they think this is true. The process of verification is something that all of us could probably benefit from. That does not solve this problem, but it is one way of attacking it, I think.
Why did we rank so low?
A lot of it is dialogue by leaders when you call the press the enemy of the people. I think people in this audience probably wouldn't have any way of realizing this, but reporters now, when they go out on the campaign trail, they, in large part with major news organizations, they've been put through security training to be aware of when crowds will turn on them. Small things, networks used to ship their equipment with their logo on it. They don't do it now because it gets vandalized. There have been murders of journalists just recently. It's a pretty tough environment.
But by saying the media is the enemy of the people, that person is using his or her First Amendment right.
They are. And
So how does that hurt our overall freedom of expression ranking?
I think that people who say that should be allowed to say it. The counter to that is more speech that is more compelling, and as I say, educating people. I think a problem in America today is that anybody who's in my business, you got into being a reporter and you knew you were going to get crap your whole life. I mean, I have a few reporters out here. It just comes with the territory. You make people angry. But I'm seeing a shift in recent years where there is an anger toward journalism, even when it relays the truth. It may not be your version of the truth. And that's where I think we're in a dangerous period where we start defining truth as whether it aligns with your ideology.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that balance to attack folks unfairly versus the right to say it?
Well, you have to put up with attacks. Of course, if they cross the line into something physical, that's a completely different conversation. Assault is not protected by the First Amendment. Murder is not protected by the First Amendment. You can't claim I beat the crap out of this guy and I was only expressing my First Amendment right.
Telling someone that right then and there is not protected by the First Amendment either.
Yeah, or telling someone else to do it and it immediately happens.
Yeah.
That's not protected by the First Amendment. But I agree with Andy in that media literacy is important across the board for every citizen here. Because again, you have this misconception, if it's fake news, then it's the journalism people who are putting out the fake news. It's not the journalists putting out the fake news. It's somebody's cousin or a great aunt or somebody who has access to, they have the technology on social media to put out their version of the truth or put out their opinion, and sometimes they are trying to deliberately sway a group to believe one thing or another. That gets into the conspiracy theories. So I think media literacy, people understanding, how do you take that photograph and reverse search that photograph to determine whether or not that photo accurately, if it goes with that story, or if it was published 30 years ago, and that individual is just using that photograph to provoke an emotion. Learning how to fact check on your own, to double check. There are many times when you see something and it's called, because you agree with it, then you automatically think it's true.
David, is that realistic? I was told by somebody way back about how you design a website. He said web users are lazy, selfish, and ruthless. They don't want to look for stuff, and if they don't find it right away, they're going to go someplace else. Is it asking too much to ask people to do all this, to fact check what they read?
Well, I think one major problem is the total volume of information is so overwhelming that one common coping strategy is just to look at things that you basically are sympathetic to in the first place. And so there's less of this overall picture of reality and much more of multiple selective ones. And you can see the problem with that. In other words, it would be good if there were more media literacy, but I'm not sure how realistic it is for the population as a whole. Yeah. And there are, in other words, if we just stay where we are, if nothing is done about this situation, other parts of the government and so on will likely act. And so the Supreme Court is one place, right, where increasingly the signs are that the majority on the court wants to make it easier to sue various kinds of misinformation purveying institutions. So, and possibly also legitimate journalistic ones, right? And if you don't like that approach, then you have to have something realistic instead. And I'm all for more education. I'm in education. It's my whole life in a way. But education alone, I don't think can cope with where we are at the moment.
I think you could cope with some of it. I agree with you. I mean, we can't turn children into fact checkers or expect everyone to be a fact checker. But, you know, I think there is a way to teach when something appears on your Instagram feed that seems incredible, that there are really basic ways to check it out. I mean, if we were checking Facebook right now and you saw a post that said, Governor DeWine, exclusive story, Governor DeWine is actually secretly married to Hillary Clinton. All right, this is an idea.
How many would click on that?
Yeah, how many would click on that? You would. It's pretty fantastic, but what you would hope is that the very basic thing would happen, that someone would Google that, you know, Mike DeWine, Hillary Clinton, secretly wed, and if it didn't show up on the New York Times or the AP or something like that, pretty good chance you would know it's false. Now, the problem in the modern era is that misinformation like that, Eddith's correct, it's often not coming from the press. It's coming from other sources. It goes around the world and it's hard to catch up with it. So a little more than a decade ago, I had this job at the Washington Post called the Ombudsman. It's basically you're the internal person investigating complaints against the newsroom. Everybody hates you, by the way. But it was at a time when the Washington Post was integrating its digital arm into its print side. And I kept hearing this phrase from the younger digital people. They talked about not wrong for long. And what that meant was, you old print guy, so you make an error, you have to wait 24 hours for the next paper. But we can do it instantly. And there is some truth to that. But it's hard to catch up with an error. And so that puts an extra burden on Eddith in a journalistic sense to train people that getting it right the first time is really critically important.
Let's move beyond the journalists. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about penalties. Looking beyond journalists. Defaming someone right now is a civil case, not a criminal one. Alex Jones has to pay $49 million for saying that the parents of those little kids shot and killed at Sadioke Elementary were actors, playing roles in a government plot. His channel is worth up to $270 million. even if he has to pay that $49 million, which he probably won't, he's still going to be a very rich man. Should he have to go to jail for profiting from those lies?
Who's that directed to?
Hey.
You take that.
Jump ball.
Well, there's a lot of complexity in your question. You made it into a opener, a closed-ended question, yes or no. I don't think he needs to go to jail. I don't think,
Is it not fraud?
Well, if that was what he was charged with, was he charged with fraud?
No, I'm just saying, but it's a
Yeah, I
kind
mean,
of fraud.
because Sandy Hook, I think most people will agree it really happened. I mean, we watched the coverage, we watched the pain on these parents' faces, and to have somebody come out and say it was a conspiracy in order to attack the gun control lobby, well, that can be you can factually show that that is not true. So what he said did, in fact, cross the limit of what the First Amendment protects. So, yeah, he should pay every dime. In order for him to go to jail, it'd have to be a criminal charge. He wasn't charged criminally. In civil court, you get money. You can't send someone to jail. And I think it would be very dangerous to put anyone in jail for an expressing opinion, even if they were lying about it.
I think an important distinction about this case is that it would be one thing if Alex Jones once said, one time only, I heard that these are fabricated, this is completely made up. In this case, he repeatedly, against overwhelming evidence, was told, no, this was real, and kept going. So that's a pretty powerful case in a civil proceeding, I think. And I wouldn't send him to jail, but I think if they get a lot more money out of him, so much the better.
And Mike, I think it's a very fine question because it's a reminder that one of the changes of the past 50 years or so is that we now have many more very wealthy people. And while I think most wealthy people understand that once you have all those resources, that brings with it increased responsibilities, there are some very rich people who are utterly irresponsible and who like to say things on the internet and in videos, again, aimed more at the young than the old, who can cause very real harm. And so it's not clear to me if the traditional financial penalties are sufficient to deter the behavior that we want to deter. So then the question is, what else do you do?
Right now, the New York Times, Washington Post, NBC, NPR, WOSU, we face penalties for saying false things, for reporting false things. Civil penalties, but penalties nonetheless. Twitter and Facebook do not face penalties if one of their users publishes a false thing. They try to monitor it and get it out. Should those companies, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Truth Social, Facebook, should they face penalties for falsehoods, known falsehoods, outright lies, are published on their sites?
And if I could jump in just to say one preliminary thing before the experts on journalism take over. The Supreme Court took this case this week, so this is not a hypothetical thing. The court is going to decide whether or not the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which shields social media platforms from suit, should be thrown out and therefore expose these folks to this. So having said that, what do you people who teach journalists think about this? I'd be very curious to hear.
Well, the rationale behind that aspect of the Communication Decency Act is the argument that the internet service provider wasn't the person who posted the information. They weren't using editorial control. They weren't editors. They didn't write the story. And if you want to punish someone, you find the person who actually put the post out there, that the internet service provider is providing just an area for people to share. But it's difficult to do if that person has a different nickname or is anonymous. How can you find that person?
Or it's not even a person.
Or it's not even
Could be
a
a
person,
bot.
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's relevant right now in another way because Elon Musk is about, it appears he's finally going to purchase Twitter. And of course, he wants to open it up. He thinks that it should be free for everyone. But you get into the problem of bots and how you monitor that, how you regulate it. Boy, that's a very tough thing to do, very tough.
Is it fair I mean, how many users are on Twitter and Facebook? I mean, they try to cull out hateful speech and violent speech. Is it fair to ask them to do more?
Yeah, sure. And I think technology may help in that regard too. We may find ways that, in the universe of an audience on Twitter or Facebook, everyone weighs in when they see something that is false, demonstrably false. But it's often not, in my opinion, highlighted enough to subsequent users. So if we get a huge backlash that says, no, Sandy Hook actually took place, this is a fabricated story, there may be ways to highlight that. Different news organizations have sort of experimented with, based on your history of commenting, that they would put you in different channels. So if you were a person that is constantly violating policies on racism, misogyny, even you're coming in different email names, they will know, and they might put you in this channel, which we'll call it the sewer channel. But over here, it might be based on your history of responsibly commenting, we'll put you here. I'm kind of intrigued by that because it's a way of channeling speech, but not regulating it, not hindering it. So I think there are ways to experiment with that.
The bottom line question is, who decides what's the truth? I mean, politicians stretch the truth, leave out inconvenient facts, but they don't outright lie for the most part. Alex Jones repeating that lie was certainly a lie. That's a pretty clear-cut case, but that's where the problem is. Who decides what's right and wrong?
Does anyone have to? I mean, there's some things that you can definitively say that is a fact error. That did not happen. It happened differently. But we all base our reality on our opinions on that information. So I don't think there should be one person or one group of people deciding, yes, you can say that, no, you cannot say that. That's censorship. That does violate the First Amendment. And one of your questions sort of referred to, should we revise the First Amendment? In today's environment, I would be very afraid to try to revise the First Amendment because we may not end up with a First Amendment at all. And then you have to remember about the history of the internet. I mean, the internet was created and developed. The first people who were using it were researchers in the military. I don't think those who first developed the internet ever expected it to be part of popular culture. And the way it was designed so it could not be regulated. There's not one place you can go to, Internet Central, and shut it down. And again, now we're not talking just about the United States, we're talking about the entire world. So when you get into international issues, and some of the misinformation is coming from other countries. No, I don't know the answer. Yes, it's very complex to solve. I think having media literacy, I'm going to still stress media literacy is important. If more people at least understood that not everything that they see on the internet is real, then let them decide if they choose to want to believe it or not. Yeah, there are probably technical ways to do that. But I would be very leery of trying to fine-tune or change how the First Amendment is.
David, you mentioned that civil penalties might be enough. Is there a danger? I mean, I'm a First Amendment purist, pure and simple. I mean, I don't want to mess with it either. But is there a danger of doing nothing? Maybe not changing the First Amendment, but increasing regulations on internet companies or looking at the fairness doctrine again or things like that?
I do think there is a real danger in doing nothing in the sense that something is going to happen. And in terms of changing the First Amendment, the polarization of the country is such that the Constitution at the moment is not amendable. In other words, getting the supermajority is required to make changes. So there's only one other way to change the U.S. Constitution at the moment, and that's through creative reinterpretation by the Supreme Court. And that is a growth industry. And so how would you do that with respect to the First Amendment? You would revisit New York Times versus Sullivan. And everything I hear I used to work in Washington back in the day, is that the Supreme Court is increasingly moving to do that.
This is the case that protects journalists and others from saying false things against public figures. And you have to show malice, actual malice,
Right.
before, even if you said something false or published something
It
false.
provided an enormous amount of protection for news media organizations. It's a landmark ruling in the 1960s, and some legal historians argue that really our current definition of press freedom under the First Amendment, more than anything else, stems from that decision. But the point is, if we do nothing, then I suspect the Supreme Court will get busy and they will, in essence, change what the First Amendment means with respect to press freedom by revisiting that decision.
Two justices want to do that.
Correct. And
Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch.
And they have more potential allies than they used to, right?
But that's another way to really, to understand New York Times versus Sullivan, it's important to understand the history behind how that case happened.
Yes,
New York Times versus Sullivan, to many people, is considered a civil rights case
yes.
because public officials in the South were trying to stop the civil rights movement. And Dr. Martin Luther King was trying to get a lot of media attention on what was going on in the South, the segregation, the Jim Crow laws. And one way to do that was to get more and more people outside of the South to understand what was going on. Well, the Southern political leaders who wanted to keep things status quo, they were using libel law as a way to silence the media. You know, if enough people were filing libel suits against reporters and news organizations for their coverage of the civil rights movement because of some mistake that they claim was made, the way the law was then, they could put newspapers out of business. And New York Times was facing, I think, had to pay $3 million to this guy called Sullivan based on some, what I would consider human error.
It was an ad. Wasn't even a news story. It was an advertisement.
You know, and Sullivan was saying, well, you know, you said, the ad said that the students were singing, you know, the national anthem. Well, that isn't true. They were singing My Country 'Tis of Thee. That's wrong. Check. And, well, yeah, we did arrest Dr. King, but we didn't arrest him 7 times. We only arrested him 4. So those were the types of mistakes that they were suing for, and people were winning. And in essence, if they kept winning, New York Times versus Sullivan wasn't the only libel case that was being filed at that time. It could have shut down the civil rights movement as well as silenced the media, because they would be too afraid to, well, we're not going to cover the civil rights movement anymore because we can't afford to lose any more libel suits. And so making public figures who have easier access, they have the money, they have easier access to the media to correct mistakes, that's fundamental, not only to a journalist's First Amendment right, but to others, because private people, they still have the negligence standard, depending on what state you're in, but they still have the negligence standard. So, because they can't just call a news conference to correct a mistake, and their reputation could be damaged severely based on that. So, keeping in mind the purpose of the New York Times versus Sullivan decision. Now, is that going to change the U.S. Supreme Court decision's mind? No, but it could help when we decide to elect other people for office.
So this is very briefly, David's onto something here. I think that will be the big test case. Yeah. And I think there are several reasons to believe that. It's not just the makeup of the Supreme Court, but the lower courts that are increasingly allowing these cases to go up so that they can get to the Supreme Court. And if I had to speculate, pure speculation, I would say where you might get a ruling that changes something in Times versus Sullivan is the definition of who is a public figure. Right. And that could be more restrictive. The beauty of Times Sullivan is that the courts basically said mistakes will happen, whether in advertising or whatever. But when it involves a public figure, especially an elected official, there is a higher bar to cross. And we want that bar up there because we want the free flow of information, as you described, because it's better for society. So I think if they start narrowing who is a public figure, then that's going to change things.
Yeah, I mean, is the quarterback at OSU the same as someone running for president?
Yes, yeah.
Right now they are.
Or I think a different question is you have people who are elected to public office, but then you have people who sometimes through no initiative of their own, they become public figures. I mean, if you remember Richard Jewell, the guy at the Atlanta, the security guard, he was, in the end, ruled a limited public figure because he allowed himself to go on the Today Show and others and be interviewed about this. So the court said, well, you made this decision. You're now a public figure. That could be narrowed, I think.
Should it be narrowed?
I don't think so. I'm happy with where Times Sullivan is right now.
What do you think?
Well, I think the likelihood that it will be narrowed some is high, especially in that public figure area. What makes me nervous is what you've already alluded to. If nothing much changes, then the likelihood of bigger changes grows, which I would not want. And if I could just add, you asked about the private sector. I write a lot about the period from the 1930s through the 1960s, and there was more censorship in American life then because it was viewed as child and family friendly. But how was it mostly achieved? Not through, in the national security realm, by the government itself, but mostly it was achieved by the government prodding the private sector to regulate itself more intensely. And so the motion picture production code, things like that. And so that would be, to my mind, a more constructive approach. In other words, the leaders of the various social media platform companies getting together, perhaps prodded by the specter of a federal law they're really not going to like, to come up with something that regulates themselves better. And I think that would fit better with American traditions, be more durable, lasting, and so on. Because one of the things that's great about where we are now is there are so many more voices that get expressed, and not just bad voices, but all kinds of different voices that didn't used to be there.
Eddith, one more question, then we'll go to audience questions. I mean, the critics of Twitter, folks who, when Twitter said Donald Trump cannot be on the platform anymore, said they were hurting his free speech rights, which legally is not true because it's a private company deciding what to do with their own business. Should companies be precluded from limiting free speech from folks like that?
No, I don't know. I think that's going to help. If private companies can control what they know is deliberately false information, the fake news, attacks on people because of their race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. If private companies can do that, self-regulate, that will prevent the government from stepping in, trying to regulate. And that's what happened with Prohibition. I mean, the government tried to control what you could drink, liquor, and that was that failed miserably. It was an amendment to the Constitution. They repealed that puppy, right? And so the liquor industry, after that, they said, we don't want to go back to that again. So they self-regulated themselves for years. I mean, it's only been within the last 10 years that you've seen TV commercials for hard liquor. For a while there, they said, we're not going to go there because we don't want the government trying to censor us again. So self-censorship can be done among the private sector to avoid the government from intervening.
Okay. It is CMC's longstanding tradition to accept questions from our audience. Lenny Cuthbert is taking questions from our live stream, and we urge you, if you have a question, to approach the microphone. We ask you to make sure they're a question and avoid long speeches and political statements and all that stuff so we can get to as many questions as we can. Lenny?
Online questions. I'm going to combine the first two. Richard Needles asks, if news literacy becomes part of school curriculum, will school boards have to decide if Fox News or MSNBC is the most literate? And along the same lines, Steve Swift asks, how does Fox News and CNN continue to maintain the news nomenclature when a significant portion of their daily broadcast is actually opinion? Shouldn't this be clarified for the viewer and possibly sanctioned by the FCC?
Well, I don't think the FCC should be sanctioning anything in that category. And I think the term literacy is being misinterpreted. I don't mean that people are making judgments on whether something's an opinion or a fact and if that content can be controlled. It is educating people to be more aware of that content and to decide for themselves if it's something they want to believe or not. Just getting people to understand how social media works. There's a big difference between social media and the traditional news media. And the line is blurring. They are confusing their grandmother's 90th birthday tweets with something that is tweeted by, the New York Times, the Washington Post. So it's just being more aware of the content. We're not, and I don't think anybody should be in a position to decide if Fox is more literate than CNN. It's not the media being literate, it's getting the citizenry to be more literate and aware of the media.
And we may want to change that name.
Yeah.
May not make it news literacy. I think that's a problem in getting this accepted in schools, that people automatically, I fully understand the first question there. You're going to tell me what to read? No, that's not it. Information literacy tells you the process by which you evaluate the truthfulness of information.
Which is the name of our class.
Yeah,
News and
ahead of the game.
News and information literacy.
When you teach your class, do you use examples of things that are false?
Well, I don't teach that class.
When your professor teaches that class, because here's the slippery slope.
But when I teach, currently I am teaching a Future of Media class, 157 first-year students. And we talk about being more information literate. And I bring examples of things that are false and put them up there, use the technology and show them, and we can talk about how can we figure out what about it is false. One of my favorite examples that I just came across this year, let me get the story. Target had to recall some of its cookies, its cookie brand. And whoever wrote that story said, oh, this is a really good cookie story. Target has to recall a particular brand of cookies. We need a photo of cookies to go with this story. So what photo did they select? A photo of Girl Scout cookies. They weren't in the box. They weren't in the box. They were lined out, but you could tell that you knew what that Samoa was. And you knew what that Thin Mint was. And you put that photograph with the story about Target's recall. It leaves the false impression that Target was recalling Girl Scout cookies when that wasn't the case at all.
But that's an easy one. What if Fox News puts up there that Joe Biden is responsible for $5 a gallon in gas, and gas is $3.50 a gallon now?
But are they stating it as a fact, or are they stating it as an opinion?
I know, but as you teach the class, if you use that example, are you not telling the class, don't trust Fox News?
I never say that.
Okay, all right.
No, I don't.
Okay.
See, y'all putting words in my mouth.
No, I'm just saying, it's a complex issue, that's why we're here.
I put up examples, but I never say that X news station is wrong and this station is right, because I've seen problems with all the media. When I teach a writing class, I try to get students, don't use any adjectives or adverbs. Use strong nouns and verbs. That makes the story more balanced. But I'm hearing more and more anchors when they're ad-libbing, using a string of adjectives that 20 years ago we wouldn't have allowed on the air. They could have gotten fired for that. But society has changed. But no, I don't advocate one political position over another or one news organization over another.
Go ahead.
So my question, Jane Scott from the Metropolitan Club, my question is related to that question, and I'd like to string this out a little bit longer. Is there an opportunity for the FCC or Twitter or probably more television and radio news to have to overtly distinguish between their news broadcast and their editorial content?
Like they used to do in the good old days. Yeah.
Because to me, that's the biggest source of misinformation. And if you want to call it media literacy or information literacy or whatever, that, I was at a family event this past weekend, and the stuff that was coming out of people's mouths that they clearly thought was news was clearly they had learned from some opinion and some editorial content. It had nothing to do with the news of the day.
Well, at the core of a lot of this is that ideology has become a business model. And you see it with Fox and you see it with MSNBC. And just my personal view is that I think that we in news media have not particularly broadcast, but even as I go on the website of the Washington Post at times, I think we don't make enough of a distinction between that. And if you look at, for instance, if you look at MSNBC and you see a news program with Andrea Mitchell at noon and then occasionally handing off to people who are commentators, I think understandably, and I'm sure this is true of many of you, you're wondering, where do they draw the line? I mean, are they talking about slanting the news this way? I think, to my mind, it would be much better to draw very clear lines of distinction. But I would also add, if we got into news information or literacy or information, that's something to teach people too, adults and children, that make that distinction. Most people do not, even when reading newspapers online. They don't see that opinion label. They think it's just an extension of the news side.
From Bill Lafayette online, many national politicians are echoing the false narrative of the stolen election. I worry that this is doing lasting damage to the electoral process. How do we respond to this with regards to the First Amendment?
David, I'll let you take that one.
Right. Well, I teach modern U.S. political history at Ohio State, and I talk to a lot of students who like to talk about this issue. And you can make more sense of this than sometimes is the case. In other words, the most interesting discussions revolve around how much easier it was to cast a ballot absentee in 2020. And because of that, we had the highest turnout in the history of the country in terms of the fraction of adults who actually cast ballots. And when you prod the better students to talk about this, it becomes a debate about whether or not it was necessary to so greatly expand sort of no excuse absentee voting. And the assumption on the part of those who didn't like this was that if you hadn't done that, because it really wasn't necessary, an overreaction to the pandemic, then the electorate would have been somewhat smaller, more normal, and the incumbent would have been reelected. And that is an interesting discussion to hear people have, right? In other words, that is not the simplistic one that one hears on the internet. People stuffing the ballot box. There's just no evidence of that. But whether or not the system overreacted to we can't know. There's no way to rerun the election and have everyone show up and maybe spread all these germs and kill many more people. But the point is, once you have at least one grain of rationality in this debate, then you can see why it leads to such a polarized and angry situation. And by the way, that's part of the challenge of this. In other words, it's a very polarized moment in the history of the country. It puts great strain on news media organizations that like to behave in a kind of nonpartisan way, but they themselves are affected by this. It's hard for them not to be. So, which is a sort of a long-winded and I'm not sure exact response to what you asked, but why does this matter? It's highly likely that that argument will play prominently in the ongoing next election cycle. And the goal is to try to report on that responsibly in ways that make people less angry and violent than they are. And this really is a serious problem. In other words, if you have irresponsible people communicating messages, not news media so much as the others, the harm you can do. And just to give one example of this, one concrete example, this is, of course, a major Jewish holiday. And one of the most troubling things in recent times is the substantial increase in anti-Semitic violence and incidents. And some of that is fueled by ever more irresponsible statements via the internet and so on. So this is not an abstract thing. It can hurt real people that you know. And so something has to be done. In other words, what I want to communicate is don't go home and think that something need not be done and that we'll weather this without any real changes. Something has to happen. And the goal is to do it in a way that is as protective of good journalistic values and the First Amendment as possible.
And to understand your responsibility to that, that's why I go back to people blame the media for all the misinformation, and they think it's the media's problem to fix, when all of us have a responsibility to protect the First Amendment by adding more truth to the conversation, by being more careful about what we share with our friends, you know, how it spreads. So I just think it's everybody's responsibility, not just rely on the journalists to solve it.
All right, we have time for one more quick question.
Hi, Lucia Valencias, Ione, Ohio. A really fascinating discussion. I guess I'm kind of thinking about sort of the disconnect between, you know, on the one hand, we don't want to silence the Alan Strodeses of the world because of the First Amendment, right? But on the other hand, we don't want them to profit. And, you know, some of these platforms have made noises in terms of like, oh, we're going to stop this. But, you know, they also profit from these kinds of things, and they get more likes and views, and, you know, their whole business model is kind of keeping you engaged, if that makes sense. I guess my question is, you know, what sort of, you know, not censorship, but you know, if you could ideally pass these things in Congress, you know, regulations or reforms would you put forward to I guess kind of take away that profit incentive?
Andy, we'll start with you. Real quickly, please. We're running out of time.
I'm not sure I would. I think that's a very slippery slope. I don't know how you would draw the line on that. I think the marketplace in many ways can regulate your profitability, but I'd be reluctant for the government to step in to try to draw lines that way.
Eddith?
I agree. I think the only regulation that I can't think of a new regulation or a new law that would work. But the fairness doctrine, when it was in place, was an attempt to provide more diverse points of view. But some people think that backfired on us when the FCC repealed that. And then you had more different types of talk radio that were geared at one particular viewpoint while ignoring other viewpoints. But the government passing a law, that would be the last thing I'd want to see. And I don't know if it would be enforceable if we're talking about the internet, because again, it's a worldwide conversation.
David?
And this takes me back to a conversation I had with Mimi Dawson in the mid-1980s when she was an FCC commissioner appointed by President Reagan. And she was an utter enthusiast for the free market approach. And I once asked her at a lunch, you know, are there, you know, what about very violent and disturbing things that could end up, and she said, oh, there are just some things no one wants to see. And I think what's happened over the past 40 years, it's become clear that there are things that are really bad that still find an audience and do social harm. So even though the free market is good in a variety of ways, you can overdo that too. And that's where we are at the moment. So how to sort of deal with that problem without overreacting, that's the challenge. And I don't have any more specific answer than that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. Doug, back to you.
Okay. Well, I hope you found today's forum inspiring, uplifting. I'm not real sure how to describe that, but thank you for today's forum partner, WOSU Public Media. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons and to the Center for Human Kindness at the Columbus Foundation and the Columbus Dispatch for supporting today's live stream. Special appreciation to today's speakers, Andrew Alexander, Eddith Dashiell, David Stebenne, and our host, Mike Thompson. Another round of applause for all of them. Thank you. Please make plans to join us next Wednesday. Franklinton, from flood wall to future, is the topic next week. That's going to be a good one. Thank you all for joining us today. We couldn't do it without you. We'll see you next Wednesday. Have a great day.